Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Madhavi and I'm excited to kick off today's presentation. We'll be exploring the supply analysis for Unit 3. This is the first slide, so I just want to briefly set the stage. We'll go over the key aspects of supply, look at some important concepts, and discuss how they apply to our current context. I promise to keep it concise and engaging. So let's get started. Let's take a closer look at how the price of a good influences the quantity supplied. When the price goes up, suppliers are generally willing to offer more of that good for sale. Conversely, if the price drops, they tend to supply less. Of course, this assumes that other factors like production costs or technology stay constant. If you look at the graph on the slide, you'll notice that the supply curve slopes upward from left to right. This visualizes the idea that higher prices lead to higher quantities supplied. For example, imagine the price of mangoes rising from rupee 50 to 80 per kilogram. Farmers will find it more profitable to sell more mangoes at that higher price, so they increase their supply accordingly. This relationship is what we call the law of supply. It captures a fundamental economic principle. As the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied tends to increase as well, and vice versa. This concept helps us understand how markets respond to price changes and how supply behavior drives market dynamics. When we talk about supply, we're referring to the quantity of a good or service that producers are willing and able to sell at various prices over a certain period of time. Now, one key factor influencing supply is the price of inputs, which are the raw materials, labor, machinery, and other resources needed to produce goods or services. If the costs of these inputs go up, producing becomes more expensive for the producer. As a result, the supply tends to decrease because it's less profitable or less feasible to produce at the same levels. Conversely, if input costs decrease, it becomes cheaper to produce, and supply generally increases. For example, think about the price of wheat. If wheat prices rise, that increases the cost of making bread. Bakeries might then decide to supply less bread because their costs are higher. This shows how input costs are a crucial factor in determining how much producers are willing to supply at different prices. It connects directly to the overall theme of supply, illustrating how production costs influence market behavior. Let's talk about technology and how it affects supply. When we have better technology, it generally improves efficiency and helps reduce production costs. This means that producers can make more goods or services using the same amount of resources, which in turn increases supply. For example, imagine a new machine that harvests crops faster. This allows farmers to supply more food to the market. Now moving on to government policies, these play a crucial role as well. When taxes on production go up, the costs for producers increase, which often leads to a decrease in supply. On the other hand, subsidies or financial help from the government can lower costs and encourage more production, thus increasing supply. Regulations are also important. They can either restrict supply or encourage it, depending on how they are designed. For instance, if the government provides a subsidy to solar panel manufacturers, they will have an incentive to produce more panels. So, in summary, technology and government policies are key factors that influence how much of a good or service is available in the market. Now, let's look at the fifth factor, expectations of future prices. When producers think that prices will go up in the future, they often hold back some of their current supply to sell later at a higher price. Conversely, if they expect prices to fall, they tend to increase their supply now to avoid losing potential profit. For example, imagine oil producers who expect oil prices to rise next month. They might choose to reduce their current supply and wait to sell at the higher future price. This behavior shows how expectations about future prices can influence current supply decisions, which in turn can affect the overall market. Let's talk about natural conditions and weather, which are especially important for agriculture. When the weather is good, crops tend to have higher yields, meaning more supply available. Conversely, bad weather events like floods or droughts can lead to lower yields and thus less supply. For example, a drought can reduce the water available for rice farming, causing rice supply to drop significantly. Understanding these natural factors helps explain how supply can fluctuate based on environmental conditions. Now let's take a closer look at the exceptions to the law of supply. The formula here, QS equals a function of several variables, captures the key factors that influence how much of a good suppliers are willing to produce. QS, of course, is the quantity supplied, and PX is the price of the good itself. The law of supply generally states that as PX increases, QS also increases, assuming all other factors stay constant. But in reality, other variables can cause deviations from this relationship. For example, PO represents the price of other goods. If the price of substitutes or related products changes, it can affect the supply of the good we're focusing on. Next, PF is the price of factors of production, things like labor, raw materials, or capital. If these costs go up or down, producers might alter how much they supply, even if the price of the good itself remains the same. Then we have T, which stands for the state of technology. Advances in technology can make production more efficient, leading to an increase in supply, while setbacks might reduce supply. Finally, G represents the goals or objectives of the firm. Sometimes, companies might choose to limit or increase supply based on strategic decisions, profit maximization, or other business objectives. So, in essence, while the law of supply provides a helpful general rule, these variables, PO, PF, T, and G, are crucial because they can cause supply to behave differently than the simple positive relationship between PX and QS. Understanding these exceptions helps us see the bigger picture of how markets actually operate. Now, let's talk about the key assumptions behind the law of supply. First, we assume that the costs of production are constant. This means that the prices of inputs like raw materials, labor, and capital stay the same. If these costs go up, suppliers might not be willing to produce more just because the selling price rises, since their profit margins would shrink. So, stable input costs are crucial for the law to hold. Next, we assume that technology remains fixed. This assumption means there are no technological improvements that could lower production costs or make it easier to produce more. If technology advances, suppliers can often produce at lower costs or increase output without raising prices, which would go against the traditional law of supply. Finally, we assume that the prices of other related goods and services stay stable. If the price of another product that a supplier could produce increases, they might shift resources toward that more profitable good. This resource reallocation would reduce the supply of the original product, so stable prices of related goods are also a key assumption. Together, these assumptions help create a simplified model of supply behavior, which is essential for understanding how supply responds to changes in price. Today, I want to talk about some key assumptions behind the law of supply. First, we assume that there is no change in government policy. This means that taxes, subsidies, and quotas are considered to stay the same, so they don't influence supply during our analysis. Next, we assume there is no change in future price expectations. Sellers are not expected to anticipate future price shifts. If they did, they might hold back some stock today if they think prices will go up later, or they might flood the market now if they expect prices to fall. But for the law of supply, we assume they don't do this. They simply supply what they can at the current prices. Then we consider transport costs to be constant. Changes in transportation expenses can impact the overall cost of production, which in turn affects supply. But here, we assume these costs stay stable, so they don't distort our supply decisions. Finally, we assume that the scale of production is fixed. That means the size of the firm and its capacity to produce are constant, at least in the short run. This helps us focus on how price influences supply without complicating factors like expanding or shrinking production capacity. All these assumptions help us isolate the relationship between price and quantity supplied, making the law of supply a reliable tool for understanding market behavior under normal conditions. Now, let's talk about some key exceptions to the law of supply. First, perishable goods like fresh fruits, vegetables, and milk. These items have a very limited shelf life, so sellers can't store them for long periods. As a result, they often have to sell more at lower prices to avoid losing too much to spoilage, especially as the products approach their expiration date. Next, agricultural products are heavily influenced by natural and climatic factors, things like weather or rainfall, that producers can't control. This means that even if prices go up, farmers can't always increase their supply quickly if they've had a poor harvest. Their ability to respond to price changes is limited by nature. Finally, consider rare goods and artistic items, such as a one-of-a-kind painting. These are perfectly inelastic in supply, meaning, no matter what the price is, the quantity available doesn't change. There's only a fixed amount because it's a unique item or a rare antique. These examples highlight how, in certain cases, supply doesn't follow the typical rules and can be quite rigid, which is important to keep in mind when analyzing markets. Let's explore some key exceptions to the law of supply. First, we have the backward-bending supply curve of labor. Typically, we think that as wages increase, people will work more. But interestingly, after a certain point, higher wages can actually lead workers to choose fewer hours and enjoy more leisure. So the supply curve bends backward, reflecting this shift in preferences. Next, consider future price expectations. Usually, we assume sellers respond to current prices, but if they believe prices will drop significantly in the future, they might actually increase their current supply at lower prices to avoid bigger losses later. Conversely, if they expect prices to rise, they might hold back supply now, waiting for better returns. Moving on, when a firm is trying to clear out old stock, say, during a liquidation sale, they might sell products at lower prices, even if it means sacrificing profit. This is a clear exception to the typical profit-driven law of supply because the goal here is to reduce inventory quickly. Finally, in a monopoly, the situation is quite different. Since the monopolist is the sole supplier, they act as the price maker. They might choose not to increase supply even if prices go up, aiming instead to restrict output to maximize their profits. All these examples highlight that, while the law of supply generally holds, there are important situations where it doesn't apply or behaves differently. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I truly appreciate the opportunity to share these insights with you. Remember, the key points we've discussed highlight the importance of understanding the core concepts and how they connect to the bigger picture. It's all about applying what we've learned to make a positive impact. I hope you feel inspired and equipped to take these ideas forward. Once again, thank you for being such an engaged audience. I look forward to seeing how you'll implement these concepts in your own work.